Today we will be demonstrating the capabilities of the Impact AC model in forecasting staffing in enlisted communities. We start with the enlisted section selected. We can see here that we have broken down the communities into groups, and within each group a number of target communities that will allow community managers to quickly select the community that they are interested in. Once they've selected a community, they can enter plans for that community over a number of fiscal years. We indicate what the inventory that Impact is going to use as the start of the forecast, as well as the authorizations that Impact will target for making healthy communities. Community managers, by default, do not have to enter any information into Impact. It is set up to run what we call a baseline scenario without any user intervention. But a lot of the power and capability of Impact comes in the ability of community managers to specify custom plans and to run what-if scenarios to explore various choices that they may make in managing their communities. The plans we split into three sections: losses, which characterizes how separations may happen within this community over the forecast period; gains, which specifies what assumptions are being made about how sailors may come into this community over the forecast period; and advancements, which specify how sailors advance from pay grade to pay grade over the course of the forecast period. We'll start by looking at losses. The default method for forecasting losses uses a linear regression model based on the demographics of the individual sailors. Age, race, gender, EMC, pay grade, length of service, education level, and a number of other demographic factors are taken into account in each sailor's decision whether or not to continue with the Navy in any given year. That separation rate can then be further modified by changes in the unemployment rate or in the SRB. If a community manager feels that the unemployment rate is going to go up or down over the next fiscal year, they can specify that change. And they can specify a change to the SRB level being offered within their community to try to influence retention rates. Within gains, Impact will attempt to gain a number of sailors into each community necessary to maintain a healthy staffing level relative to their authorizations. If community managers wish, they can, instead of letting Impact do that planning, they can enter a manual gains plan if they would like to refine the default that Impact provides, or if they would like to run a what-if scenario to see what impact different levels of gains might have on their community in the future. Impact does simulate the training pipeline. It takes into account what the attrition rate from recruitment to rating is, as well as the length of the training pipeline for a typical sailor in this EMC. And community managers may override one or both of those things if they feel that their community is going to be different in the future than it has in the past. Impact also displays what the default gender and race distribution will be for new simulated recruits created during the course of the simulation. These numbers all vary by EMC. Within advancements, Impact again will attempt to, by default, advance a number of sailors into each pay grade necessary for that pay grade to be healthy relative to the authorizations number. After a forecast is run, Impact will also show what the forecasted vacancies were for each pay grade and advancement cycle, as well as the number of eligible sailors who were eligible for advancement into that pay grade during that advancement cycle. Rather than letting Impact calculate a default advancement rate, community managers can also specify a manual number, again, if they would like to refine the number that Impact is providing, or if they would like to run a what-if scenario to see what impact different advancement decisions may have on their community. Impact does model the actual advancement processes that take place in the Navy over the course of the year. So you see we have E4 fall and E4 spring advancement cycles, representing the fall and spring cycles that actually happen within the Navy. Advancements to E2 and E3 just as in the real world, happen based on the time and grade of sailors as soon as a sailor meets the minimum time and grade necessary to advance to E2 or E3. Impact advances them. Impact also performs all-Navy reconciliation. In addition to specifying plans for each individual community, you have the choice of entering a target end strength as well as a target number of accessions that are planned for the fiscal year. When run in reconciliation mode, if either of those constraints is going to be violated, Impact will forecast some actions that could be taken to bring the Navy into line with those constraints. There's some other options for specifying how end strength reconciliation or accession reconciliation should occur. Users have the ability to decide that one or more communities should not be affected by any cuts to accessions or end strength necessary to bring the Navy as a whole into line, which is called fencing. By default, a community is in what they call spread mode, in which case it is going to receive a proportion of cuts necessary to bring the Navy as a whole in line with the constraint, proportional to the size of that particular community. That is to say, they're going to take a spread of the cuts. And users have the ability to manually enter a number of accessions, or for end strength cuts, a number of force shaping losses manually, if they would like to see what effect a specific course of action might have on their community. They can enter that course of action here and ask Impact to forecast that for them. There's a similar dialog down here for end strength, where a user can say that some communities should not be affected by force shaping cuts to meet end strength requirements. They should take their fair share of the spread of the cuts or should have a manual number of cuts entered. For the time being, we'll leave these all as spread. Once the community manager has set up the scenario that they'd like to see run, they can then run that scenario. We're just going to run a short scenario, and we're going to choose to reconcile the plans, which will put in place some extra processes to force end strength cuts down to 270,000 if necessary, and limit the total number of accessions to 31,000 if necessary. Running the forecast does take a few minutes, so we're going to pause the recording and rejoin this in a minute when it's completed. And it's time for us to look at some results. I'm going to start by looking at a specific community. Start with the bosun's mates. I'm going to close the plans section so we can get a better look at the resulting forecast charts. So Impact is suggesting that the bosun's mates are starting out fiscal year 13 understaffed relative to their authorizations, and it suggests that if we were to pull in somewhere between 900 and 1,000 sailors in each of the next 2 years, and assuming losses on the order of about 600 sailors over the next 2 years, that we could get the bosun's mates back up towards their authorizations numbers. Impact also breaks down the forecasts by a number of different metrics. We can see the gains, what sources Impact thinks would be good for the gains, gains directly from the training pipeline versus gains from the pact. Breaks down separations by pay grade, separations by type, transfers in, etc., etc. A number of charts that will be useful for community managers to get an understanding of how Impact is forecasting their community is going to change over time. If we go back to the all-Navy view, we have a couple of other charts that may be of interest. So here's the all-Navy yearly end strength forecast. And here we see that Impact is forecasting that end strength will be below authorizations for both years of this particular forecast. So Impact would not have suggested any force shaping losses over the course of this simulation. And Impact is forecasting that separations will be greater than gains in both of fiscal year 13 and fiscal year 14 for an overall downward trend of the end strength for the Navy as a whole. Some other charts that may be of interest to us. We have a chart for the forecasted accessions versus the constraint. So here we can see that Impact is essentially accessing sailors at the constraint for each of the next 2 years, and we can see the accession's health breakdown. This is the percentage of communities that are receiving the accessions they need, are not receiving the accessions they need, or receiving more than the accessions that they think they need over the course of the simulation. So far we've been talking about strategic planning. I'd like to now move on to talk about execution monitoring. I'm going to go back to our bosons maintenance community to talk about that. Strategic planning is what we call the long-term forecasting for 2, 3, 4, 7, up to 30 years of forecasting, the staffing for the Navy. Impact also supports execution year monitoring, where we check how we are tracking, how the actuals are tracking to the plan that was approved by Navy leadership. So I'm going to start with the cumulative actuals versus planned separations chart. There are a number of lines on this chart. The first is this red dashed line down here, where we show the plan that was generated, probably the middle of the previous fiscal year, based on the most up-to-date information at that time. And this is what was actually planned against during when the plans for fiscal year 13 were being generated. We also show a gray dashed line, which is a beginning of year forecast based on actual inventory as of October 1 of fiscal year 13. We create that new forecast of separations, as well as the gray shaded area around that forecast being the error bars around that forecast to give a sense of the uncertainty of where we think that might end up. The blue line represents the actual losses so far this year. In this version of Impact, we only have data up to the end of January 13, January fiscal year 13. And then as each month of actual data comes in, Impact produces an updated forecast based on the most recent inventory data. As we go along the fiscal year, Impact provides a number of other charts that display actuals versus forecasts. Here's an end strength chart where for the months that have not yet happened, we show the forecasted separations and gains for this particular community, and for those months that have already occurred, we show the actuals and how we're tracking against them. We also have the actual ending inventory for each month here, as well as updated forecasts of what the year-long inventory structure for this community will look like. Another chart that shows this well is the separations by type chart, where the stacked area chart in the background shows Impact's forecast of losses. Impact only breaks down forecast separations by EAOS, non-EAOS, and forced losses. As previously mentioned, since our end strength is below our authorizations, we don't have any forced losses in this particular forecast. And then as actual data comes in month to month, Impact overlays these bar charts that show the actual separations broken down by the separation codes of interest to the Navy. How many retirements were there in this month, how many losses for physical reasons, etc., etc. And that concludes today's demonstration of the Impact AC model. Thank you for your attention.